to tonight's lecture. Anselm House is a center for Christian thought serving the University of Minnesota. Our mission is to connect faith and knowledge with all of life. We stand in a long Christian tradition of faith-seeking understanding, a phrase made famous by our namesake, Saint Anselm of Canterbury. To state this mission somewhat differently, in the form of a question, we might say, how does belief in the person of Jesus Christ matter for our understanding of all of life and reality? We pursue that mission here at Minnesota's flagship research university because we believe that the pursuit of knowledge is a public good worth supporting, and because we believe that engagement with the Christian faith can be of benefit to all seekers of truth. Whatever your faith commitment, your area of interest or study, or your relationship to the university, we're so glad that you're joining us tonight. Tonight's lecture is the 29th annual Paul Holmer Lecture in Christianity and the Humanities. Our lecture is named after the late Paul Holmer, who was a Christian philosopher and theologian who taught here at the U as well as at Yale, and who demonstrated a lifelong commitment to the integration of faith and reason. For nearly 3 decades now, Anselm House has remembered Dr. Holmer's legacy by hosting this annual lectureship that explores the intersections of the Christian faith with different subjects in the humanities. Tonight's lecture with Dr. Morson, exploring Christianity, atheism, and faith in the modern Russian intellectual tradition, continues this long tradition. But tonight's lecture is also a first for us. This is the first time that we've hosted the Holmer Lecture in conjunction with the James Cunningham Memorial Lecture on Eastern Orthodox History and Culture, a lectureship that has been hosted for many years at the university by Minnesota's History Department. You're going to hear more about this Cunningham lecture in a moment, but I want to take this opportunity to thank especially Professor Theo Stavru for all of his work in helping make this partnership possible this year. It's been a delight to partner with you, Theo, in bringing the Cunningham lecture back to the university after a few years' hiatus. Before we proceed with tonight's lecture, would you please take a moment just to make sure that your cell phones are on silent? And you will also notice on your seat as you came in, we've got some evaluation cards for tonight's event. We would welcome you filling those out at the end of the evening, giving us feedback on how you found the event. And we're going to be giving away a copy of Dr. Morson's recent book, Wonder Confronts Certainty, Russian Writers on the Timeless Questions and Why Their Answers Matter. We're going to select that winner at random from among people that fill out the evaluation cards. And we do need your email address on there if you want to be eligible to win a copy of Dr. Morson's book. A note on sound as well. This is a beautiful room, but sometimes the sound can be a bit challenging. So if you find yourself sitting somewhere where you're having a hard time hearing, I would recommend just moving, trying a different seat in the room, and hopefully that will improve things for you. Finally, we plan on having an extended time of Q&A with Dr. Morson at the end of the lecture, so I would invite you, as questions emerge as you're listening to the lecture, to make notes of that so that you can ask those during our Q&A time tonight. I'll now welcome to the podium 2 of our partners for tonight's lecture. First, I'll invite Professor Sarah Chambers, who is chair of the History Department here at the U, to offer a welcome on behalf of the History Department. Immediately after that, Dr. Theo Stavru, professor of history and founder of the James Cunningham Lecture, will introduce for us this year's Paul Holmer and James Cunningham Lecturer. So thank you so much, Dr. Chambers and Dr. Stavru, for joining us for tonight's event.
Good evening. As the chair of the History Department here at the University of Minnesota, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Cunningham Lecture, held jointly this year with the Holmer Lecture in Christianity and the Humanities. The lecture series, the Cunningham Lecture Series, was established to honor James Cunningham, one of our distinguished alumni who completed his PhD in 1973 in modern European history with an emphasis on Russia and on the history and culture of the Eastern Orthodox Church. After completing his graduate studies here, Professor Cunningham taught for 2 decades at the history department at St. Catherine University in St. Paul, where he was beloved by students and colleagues. He published 2 important books. One, A Vanquished Hope, The Movement for Church Renewal in Russia, 1905 to 1906, and then posthumously, The Gates of Hell, The Great Council of the Russian Orthodox Church, 1917 to 1918. And so, in his memory, initially supported by his family and friends, the main objective of the Cunningham Lecture Series is to promote scholarship and disseminate information on the history and culture of the Eastern Orthodox tradition in its global context by inviting leading scholars to campus, like this evening's speaker. To introduce that speaker, I will invite up my distinguished colleague and former director of the Modern Greek Studies Center, Professor Theophanis Stavru. Professor Stavru has been an anchor of studies in Russian Orthodox history and culture here at the university, and this year was honored for his lifetime contributions to science, culture, and humanism from the Greek and Cypriot Cultural Society in Athens. Theo.
This is indeed a pleasure to, first of all, welcome all of you here and to start again the second cycle of the Cunningham Lectures. I must say that for a while, the lectures were kind of the event of the year at the university. We had as many as 200 and 300 people attending, and it was a learning experience for students, faculty, as well as administrators and members of the community. And I am delighted that the person who is going to sort of start the second cycle of the Cunningham Lecture Series, Professor Morson, is one who was really a participant in the first cycle, because in 1999, of November 5, he gave an incredibly important lecture on Brothers Karamazov and the Holy Spirit, which is still remembered by all of us who happened to attend that meeting. And this is an auspicious occasion for me as well as for the history department, because I really do believe that the Cunningham Lecture Series will continue, and indeed it should continue. Now, our speaker this evening is a man who deserves a long introduction, but he does not need one. As a matter of fact, the last time when he was introduced by Professor Gary Jan, and he gave a beautiful, full introduction. And I remember Professor Morson standing up and say, "Thank you for that beautiful introduction, and for the time left to me," and he proceeded. I don't want him to say the same thing this evening. Therefore, I'm summarizing, because our guest this evening, a distinguished professor of Slavic languages and literature at Northwestern University, where he has taught since 1986. 12 years earlier, he had taught at the University of Pennsylvania. In both of these universities, he left his indelible mark as a teaching and publishing scholar. Not only he continued his research on Russian culture and Russian literature, but he also was an innovator as an administrator, both at Pennsylvania and at Northwestern. And I don't know of many other professors who managed to get the president of Northwestern University to teach a course with him and also to co-author 2 books. I would say that is a first. Let's see who among my colleagues here will be able to accomplish that by approaching President Cunningham on Monday morning. Anyway, this gives you an idea, in other words, how the work of this individual speaks for itself. He does not really need a long introduction, but I'm going to add a couple of more points. First of all, he is a prolific author. He has written, co-authored, or published, or edited over 21 monographs on important Russian writers and their work of the 19th century, some prosopographical studies, and some work on 19th century Russian philosophers and critics like the well-known Mikhail Bakhtin. But for me, the thing that really makes him a memorable person is that not only he continues his research in an amazing, alarming way that every year for the last 4 decades he's presenting us not only with monographs, but with something during these many years of over 200 articles and interviews, not only in professional journals, but also in newspapers such as the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the Wall Street Journal. In other words, he's really a public intellectual as well as a scholar at Northwestern University. If you look at the publications, his publications, it's like a who's who of American university presses. He has published with so many American university presses. This is also true, the kind of awards that he has received. As a matter of fact, really, I want to mention only 3 representatives of the many awards that speak of his accomplishments. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Also, he received the Career Outstanding Scholar Award of the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages, and of course, for the book that has just been introduced, that is to say, Wonder Confronts Certainty, he also received the Robert Penn Warren Leanth Books Award. And the list goes on, and then the introduction becomes very long. But I will end it on this note. I very seldom use the word magisterial when it comes to books, but I can speak quite responsibly when I say that the book, a copy of which will be distributed to you, to one person who will be lucky enough to win it. In other words, the Russian writers who are giving us some answers to some of the timeless questions, in other words, wonder, confronting certainty, and what have you, is indeed a magisterial book. In fact, really, I suggest that after the performance of Professor Morson this evening, and if he lives up to our expectations, we should really have a series of seminars discussing that book in some detail. Now, I conclude with this remark. It's remarkable that he has shown the interest not only in Russian literature and culture, but especially in an aspect of Russian history and culture, namely the religious or the metaphysical component. And for me, as a student of Russian history and Russian Orthodox Church, I think one of the most remarkable phenomena of the 20th century is that despite the most systematic persecution of religion since the early times, the survival and revival of religion in the Soviet Union in the 20th century, I view it as one of the miracles of our times. It's remarkable. And there's somebody whom I know our speaker knows very well, the Polish critic, Czesław Miłosz, put it very cogently, I must say. Listen to this, please. It is a formidable paradox that in the countries where Christian churches thrive, there are practically no genuine Christian novels. Truly Christian writing has had to come from Russia, where Christians have been persecuted for several decades. It's a paradox, but it is something that makes one appreciate why people like our speaker this evening wants to look into this phenomenon. And this evening, he's going to give us a little taste of that fantastic phenomenon with his beautiful presentation that deals with the topic of Russian atheism and Russian faith. Professor Morson, this is the second time I have the pleasure of introducing you. And I cannot tell you how joyful I feel about it. We are pleased to have you here.
In the few remaining moments, bless you, Theo. When I came here, I was talking to Theo about what a wonderful time I had here, I thought 10 years ago. It was 26 years ago, but it felt, I remembered it vividly, and how much I enjoyed it and how much it meant to me, particularly Theo's hospitality and conversation, that I thought it was only 10 or 12 years ago. Excuse me. Better do it this way. So my topic tonight is Atheism and Christian Faith, Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn. It consists of an introduction followed by 8 short parts. I tell you that so that you'll always know how much you have left to sit through. It begins with an opening quotation, an epigraph from Solzhenitsyn. Nothing worthwhile can be built on a neglect of higher meanings. Can there be ethics without belief in something beyond the material world governed by natural laws? Do good and evil have any non-arbitrary basis? These questions have haunted Russian literature and history. We face the same questions, and so Russian debates have a lot to teach us today. The 8 parts of this talk are divided into 3 sections. The first consider Dostoevsky, a Russian Orthodox Christian, who addressed the ethical consequences of materialism and atheism with special force. Famously, his characters proclaim that if there is no God, all is permitted. And he meant all. It is no accident that Dostoevsky was the only 19th century thinker to predict what we have come to call totalitarianism, and he predicted it in detail. The next section turns to the creator of totalitarianism, Lenin, who discerned where materialism leads if taken to the extreme, and that is where he took it. Finally, I turn to thinkers who reflected on the horrible results of Leninist thought. Through suffering, some, most notably Solzhenitsyn, found their way back to Orthodox Christianity. So the first section is called, Is Morality Mere Prejudice? When the impoverished Raskolnikov, the hero of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, is contemplating murder, he encounters the drunkard Marmeladov, hears his story, and accompanies him home. There he finds a wretched family at the extreme of poverty, barely supported by Marmeladov's daughter Sonia, who out of love for her stepmother and her stepmother's children has become a prostitute to support them. So overcome with pity is Raskolnikov that he leaves his last kopecks with them. No sooner does he leave than his pity yields to cynicism. Quote, "What a stupid thing I've done," he thought to himself. "They have Sonia, and I want the money myself." Unquote. A few seconds later, he reverses himself again and returns to moralism. They've gotten used to be supported by Sonia, he reflects, because, quote, "man gets used to everything, the scoundrel." He means that some things are so morally awful, one should never get used to them. We usually think of adaptability as a great human achievement, but Raskolnikov sees it as enabling acceptance of evil. A minute later, Raskolnikov yet again turns on a dime and professes complete amoralism. I quote, "He sank into thought. And what if I'm wrong?" he cried suddenly after a moment's thought. "What if man is not really a scoundrel? Man in general, I mean. I mean the whole race of mankind. Then all the rest is prejudice, simply artificial terrors, and there are no barriers, and it's all as it should be." Unquote. Raskolnikov alludes to a doctrine fashionable then and ever since. Since there is nothing but matter and the laws of nature, morality is only a matter of social convention with no substantial basis. To think otherwise is to succumb to prejudice. If I drop my pencil, it falls at 9.8 meters per second squared. Is that moral or immoral? The question obviously makes no sense. But the same conclusion must apply to human actions if people are, as materialism teaches, more complex but fundamentally no different from that pencil. Apart from prejudice, fostered by social conventions and reinforced by habit, there's no right and wrong. This is what Raskolnikov means by calling the pangs of conscience artificial terrors. You can't argue with science. It follows that for the person who really understands the world scientifically, quote, "there are no barriers." In other words, all is permitted. In saying it's all as it should be, Raskolnikov means that since natural laws are entirely deterministic, things cannot be other than they are. A few chapters later, Raskolnikov again oscillates between pity and scientific amoralism. After rescuing a sexually victimized young woman from a sleazy predator, he suddenly reverses himself. There are no moral questions to consider, he says, because social science rules them out. Quote, "That's as it should be," they tell us. "A certain percentage must every year go that way." A percentage! What splendid words they have. They are so scientific. Once you've said percentage, there's nothing more to worry about. And yet he can't accept such amoralism. He suddenly asks himself, quote, "But what if my sister Dunya were part of the percentage?" Unquote. Part 2 is called, "Why Not Commit Crimes?" In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky sharpens these questions. As a student of natural science, Ivan believes in the materialist and deterministic worldview. What happens is what has to happen. Or as he puts it, it's all just nature. And yet, Ivan cannot accept such indifference to human suffering. In the famous chapter, Rebellion, he offers a catalog of heart-rending child abuse cases and challenges his pious brother Alyosha to reconcile such crimes with belief in a beneficent God. And since, by the way, all those cases were real from the Russian press, the readers were put in the same position. Ivan's moral outrage at cruelty to children makes it clear that he cannot, just cannot, accept the idea that morality is no more than a social construct. It must somehow be inscribed in the nature of things. Ivan is torn between two opposing worldviews. He can neither reject nor accept the scientific approach to moral questions. The contradiction tears him apart, as the title of the most important part of the novel, Pro and Contra, suggests. Unable to commit himself to either position, Ivan remains aloof. He tries to live as if he were only a witness of the life lived by others. And so he publishes his articles under the pseudonym The Observer, that is, someone who does not participate. Ivan's articles are deeply paradoxical. In one of the most important journals, the narrator explains, Ivan published, quote, a strange article which attracted general notice on a subject of which he might have been expected to know nothing, as he was a student of natural science, unquote. Its topic was the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical, as opposed to state, courts. What was especially perplexing was the article's tone and its unexpected conclusion. I quote, many of the church party regarded him unquestionably on their side. And yet, not only the secularists, but even the atheists joined them in their applause. Finally, some sagacious persons opined that the article was nothing but an impudent satirical burlesque, unquote. Here, as always, Ivan avoids committing himself. He tries out opposing positions, but does not endorse either. Each refutes and is refuted by the other. To distance himself still further, Ivan writes in code, which he expects no one to be able to decipher. He is amazed when the wise monk and elder, Father Zosima, who is a brilliant psychologist, actually does decipher it. The real question this strange article considers is, why should one not commit crimes? One answer is symbolized by state courts, because if one breaks the law, one will be punished. For materialists who believe that morality is only a social construct, that is the only possible answer. It would seem to follow that if one can be certain of not being caught, one has no reason to refrain from crime. Still more troubling, murder becomes essentially the same thing as littering, except that the punishment is greater. By church courts, Ivan has in mind an entirely different answer. One does not commit crimes simply because doing so is wrong, whether or not one is caught and punished. But if one does not believe in anything beyond the material world, where do non-arbitrary standards of right and wrong come from? Part 3 is called Sorry to Lose God. Later in the book, Ivan's brother Dmitri, who has been accused of murder, is troubled when the intellectual Rakitin, who professes all fashionable progressive beliefs and plans to make his career by them, offers 3 reasons that right and wrong are just so much prejudice, nothing but a tool to restrain the ignorant. Several times in the novel, characters cite Voltaire's dictum that if there were no God, he would have to be invented. Rakitin's first reason for regarding ethics as mere prejudice is that people are entirely shaped by social forces, have no free choice, and therefore cannot be morally responsible for anything. As Dmitri tells Alyosha, quote, he wants to say that he, that is Dmitri, couldn't help murdering his father because he was corrupted by his environment, and so on. He's going to put in a tinge of socialism, too, he says, unquote. Rakitin has also, by environment, of course, the term was at that point used to mean not trees and flowers, but the social environment, right? Rakitin has also argued that, as Dmitri paraphrases his point, quote, goodness is one thing with me and another with a Chinese person, so it's a relative thing. Or isn't it? You won't laugh if I tell you that it's kept me awake 2 nights. I only wonder now how people can live and think nothing about it, unquote. Rakitin's third reason for amoralism sounds so contemporary that today's readers are often shocked, as I once was, to discover it in a 19th century novel. There is no soul, no self to hold responsible, only a brain that functions as it must. This idea had been advanced as early as 1862 by Ivan Sechenov in his famous book, Reflexes of the Brain, which argues that all our actions and all our supposed choices are really nothing but neurological reflexes, more complex but essentially no different from the narrowing of pupils in the dark. By the way, Sechenov's most famous student was Ivan Pavlov. Or as Dmitri humorously paraphrases Rakitin's point, quote, imagine inside, in the nerves, in the head, that is, these nerves and they're in the brain, damn them, there are these sort of little tails, the little tails of the, Dmitri is no intellectual, they're little tails of those nerves, and as soon as they begin quivering, that is, you see, I look at something with my eyes, and they begin quivering, those little tails. And when they quiver, an image appears, that is, an object, an action, damn it. That's why I see and think, because of those tails, not at all because I have a soul, and that I am some sort of image and likeness of God. It's magnificent, Alyosha, this science, and yet I'm sorry to lose God. Well, that's a good thing anyway, said Alyosha, unquote. Dmitri asked Rakitin, does that mean that all is permitted? Didn't you know, Rakitin answered, laughing, a clever man can do what he likes. All is permitted is a phrase actually belonging to Ivan. It first appears in the gathering in Father Zosima's cell at the beginning of the novel. The pompous liberal Musev, who was annoyed that Ivan does not show him sufficient respect, acidly paraphrases something Ivan supposedly said. So this is, I quote now, Musev paraphrasing Ivan. I'll tell you another interesting thing, and rather characteristic anecdote of Ivan Fyodorovich himself. Only 5 days ago, in a gathering here, principally of ladies, he solemnly declared in argument that there was nothing in the whole world to make men love their neighbors, that there was no law of nature that men should love mankind, and that if there had been any love hitherto, it was not owing to a natural law, but simply because men have believed in immortality. Ivan Fyodorovich answered in parenthesis that if you were to destroy in mankind the belief in immortality, not only love, but every living force maintaining the life of the world would at once be dried up. Moreover, nothing would be immoral. Everything would be permitted, even cannibalism. That's not all. He ended by asserting that for every individual like ourselves, who does not believe in God or immortality, the moral law of nature must immediately be changed into the exact contrary of the former religious law, and that egoism, even to crime, must become not only permitted, but even recognized as the inevitable, the most rational, even most honorable outcome of his position. From this paradox, gentlemen, you can judge of the rest of our eccentric and paradoxical friend Ivan Fyodorovich's theories. For every individual like ourselves who does not believe in God or immortality, Musev is so used to speaking only with those like himself that he assumes that everyone is a non-believer, even when, as here, he is addressing monks in a monastery. Ivan has presumably been exaggerating his position provocatively in a company of society ladies, easy to shock, And Musa may be exaggerating the exaggeration to make Ivan seem ridiculous. But Ivan's point is still clear enough. If there is nothing beyond this material world, there can be no right and wrong. In that case, all is permitted, even cannibalism, that is, even treating other people as nothing but meat, because if one is a materialist, that is ultimately all people are. What is more, meaning, that is, every living force maintaining the life of the world, as he calls it, meaning disappears along with morality, since it must also be entirely arbitrary. The laws of nature don't mean anything. A point the existentialists, who often agreed with Ivan, were to admire in Dostoevsky. Even after Raskolnikov has confessed and been sent to Siberia at the end of Crime and Punishment, he is still not convinced that he has done anything morally wrong. He asks himself, quote, "Why does my action seem so horrible to them? Why does it strike them so horrible?" he asks himself. Is it because it was a crime? What is meant by crime? My conscience is at rest, unquote. Then Raskolnikov has a mythic dream. Dostoevsky here departs from realism to dramatize his hero's mysterious discovery of the supernatural. Raskolnikov's dream shows him the consequence of his views. He wakes up convinced that Sonia, who has followed him to Siberia, and whose love for others reflects her deep Russian Orthodox faith, must be right after all. She has read him the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, and the novel ends looking forward to Raskolnikov's own gradual resurrection into life and faith. Ivan Karamazov, never quite attains faith. But as Father Zosima tells him, if he does not find it, he will go on seeking. Quote, "You know, that is the peculiarity of your heart, and all its suffering is due to it. But thank the Creator who has given you a lofty heart of such suffering, of thinking and seeking higher things, for our dwelling is in the heavens." He will either find meaning or he will go on seeking it, but he just won't remain complacent. Part 4, I turn to Leninist ethics. The detective Porfiry Petrovich tells Raskolnikov that if he had invented another theory justifying murder, the result might have been 1,000 times worse. The comment alludes, as this novel frequently does, to terrorism, revolution, and the sort of regime that would, in fact, take power in Russia in October 1917. Until a few years ago, I thought that the Bolshevik position on ethics was that if it is necessary to kill someone, then it was permissible to do so. That was indeed the position of some other revolutionaries, like the anarchist Peter Kropotkin, who explained, quote, "The question is how to attain the greatest results with the most limited amount of civil war and a minimum of mutual embitterment." Lenin regarded this position as absurd, even counter-revolutionary. To think that revolutionaries should minimize victims, argued Lenin and Trotsky, is to presume that human life is sacred. But people are nothing but material objects, and to imagine otherwise is to adopt an essentially religious perspective. You might as well directly assert that man is made in the image of God and has a soul, said Lenin. Trotsky famously insisted that Bolsheviks should, quote, "put an end once and for all to the papist Quaker babble about the sanctity of human life. Execute mercilessly," unquote. As I studied the works of Lenin, I was struck by how frequently the words mercilessly, pitilessly, and various synonyms occur. Mercy was, in fact, a Bolshevik vice, and Soviet schoolchildren were taught to overcome their instinctive compassion. Lenin always insisted on the most violent solutions. Long before taking power, he had called for civil war as an end in itself. And in 1908, he recommended, quote, real nationwide terror which invigorates the country and through which the great French Revolution achieved glory, unquote. By the end of 1917, that is within 2 months of taking power, Lenin had set up the Cheka, or secret police, to terrorize the population. People were arrested at random. Quote, we must execute the innocent and not only the guilty, explained Commissar of Justice Nikolai Krylenko. Quote, execution of the innocent will impress the masses even more, unquote. Lenin was particularly fond of taking hostages and hanging them in public. Contrary to received opinion, torture was not Stalin's innovation. Lenin's Cheka made it routine, with local Cheka units each developing their own expertise in inflicting pain. One specialized in burning alive, another in scalping, yet another in crucifixion, impaling people, killing children in front of their parents, and locking people in cells covered with corpses were all popular practices. Quote, Lenin famously explained, quote, when we are reproached with cruelty, we wonder how people can forget the most elementary Marxism, unquote. For Lenin, morality was synonymous with effectiveness. Whatever strengthens the power of the Communist Party was by definition moral, and to do anything else was by definition immoral. For Lenin, refraining from exterminating a defeated enemy was a crime. He once even had one of his other Central Committee members examined for insanity for refusing, for withholding killing somebody. People accuse us of having no ethics, declared Lenin in a 1920 speech, but that is slander. What Bolsheviks reject, he said, is ethics, quote, in the sense given to it by the bourgeoisie, who base their ethics on God's commandments or on idealist or semi-idealist phrases, which always amounted to something very similar to God's commandments, unquote. Bourgeois thinkers mistakenly locate the source of morality outside the material world and regard moral precepts as somehow objective, like Euclidean geometry. Bolsheviks, by contrast, reject, quote, any morality based on extra-human and extra-class concepts. There is no such thing as morality that stands outside human society. That is a fraud, unquote. According to Marxism, morality is always constructed to serve the interest of a social class. It is not objectively true, as it pretends to be, but simply a way of maintaining the power of the rulers. The only morality that is not relative is that of the proletariat, the final social class destined to achieve the perfect communist society to last forever. It follows that whatever serves the interests of the proletariat, that is, as represented by the Communist Party, is moral. The point is not that the interests of the revolution outweigh all other moral considerations. Rather, there are no other moral considerations. Communist actions cannot be judged according to any moral standards because there are no moral standards outside its interests. Or in Lenin's words, quote, we do not believe in an eternal morality, and we expose the falseness of the fables about morality, unquote. Lenin regretted that most people still regard others as ends rather than means, worry about individual guilt, and hesitate to kill children. Torture and destruction of whole cities actually shocks them. Amazingly enough, Lenin reproached his followers for not showing sufficient bloodthirstiness. He ascribed any hesitancy to squishy squeamish, spineless, dull-witted liberalism. Those are all his phrases. And an essentially religious respect for human life in the abstract. He liked to call it, quote, moralizing vomit, unquote. Lenin had his distinct kind of rhetoric. Quote, any display of weakness, hesitation, or sentimentality would be an immense crime against socialism, he urged. The party, as one historian observed, quote, had to threaten provincial Soviets with severe punishments for failing to implement its terrorist directive. To show compassion was to risk being accused of covert religiosity. And so it was always safer to be as bloodthirsty as possible. When Stalin gave provinces quotas for arresting people, it didn't matter who. Local officials, if they knew what was good for them, asked to arrest even more. Starting with Lenin, cruelty became a Bolshevik virtue. Krylenko famously observed that in the early days of the regime, when Bolsheviks were surrounded by enemies, they mistakenly showed, not excessive cruelty, but, quote, unnecessary leniency and unnecessary soft-heartedness, unquote. Terror was not, as some supposed, a regrettable necessity during a civil war. On the contrary, Bolshevik terror began before there was any armed opposition, and in fact is what helped to create it. No, terror, as Lenin made clear, was to be a permanent feature of the regime. When People's Commissariat of Justice D.I. Kursky was producing the first Soviet legal code, Lenin demanded that terror and arbitrary use of power be written into the code itself. The law should not abolish terror, he insisted. It should be substantiated and legalized in principle without evasion or embellishment, unquote. I know of no other law code that demands lawlessness. Far from being a departure from Leninism, as Khrushchev was to claim, Stalin's terror was entirely in accord with it. The slogan, "Stalin is Lenin today," made eminent sense. Historians have often been puzzled by Stalin's purges. Why waste the time of interrogators to make people to confess to crimes everyone knew were fictitious? Why not just shoot them? What sense did it make to spend precious resources educating scientists, then arresting them and sending them to labor camps to do manual labor at 50 degrees below zero? Why target engineers when one was trying to industrialize? Why make a point of arresting the most hardworking and productive peasants? And what sense did it make, when the danger of Nazi Germany was apparent, to condemn 90% of the country's top generals and admirals? Some have supposed that slave labor served an economic purpose, but it was clear that the cost of maintaining the camps exceeded the value of what they produced. As some historians have noted, there is something preposterous about Stalin's crimes, which seem to defy rational explanation. To answer these questions, I think, one must first recognize that they all presume that violence and cruelty required a reason. But in Soviet ethics, the reverse was true. It was compassion and respect for life that had to be justified. As we would say today, cruelty was the default position. This horrifying conclusion derives from the Soviet willingness to take materialism and atheism to their logical extreme. That extreme prompted some Soviet writers to re-examine their philosophical convictions. So part 5 is called Suffering and Faith. And here's a paradox. It's almost the one that Theo mentioned. In the most militantly atheist state that had ever existed, 3 of the 4 greatest prose works were avowedly Christian. Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, and Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. The 4th, the Jewish Vasily Grossman's novel Life and Fate, also affirms absolute morality and the sanctity of human life. In my view, it too owes much to the Russian Orthodox tradition as it developed in Russian literature. The main explanation of this paradox is that extreme situations provoke fundamental rethinking. Suffering, especially great suffering, can lead to faith. The epigraph to the brothers Karamazov captures this truth. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat falleth on the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. That is, it has to suffer to be transformed. That's from John 12:24. Suffering shakes our worldview as no argument could. In Russian thought, it is a way of knowing. Identifying with the suffering Jesus informs the peculiarly orthodox virtue of kenosis. Svetlana Alexeyevich recently observed, quote, I think of suffering as the highest form of information, having a direct connection with mystery, with the mystery of life. All of Russian literature is about that. It has written more about suffering than about love, unquote. In her Nobel Prize speech, she maintained that suffering gives Russian thought its profundity. Quote, suffering is our capital, our natural resource, not gas or oil, but suffering. Even in the memoirs of atheists who survived the camps, one comes across observations that the only people one could count on not to do something disreputable were the believers. Conversely, the readiest to behave badly were the former party members. Yevgenia Ginsburg, who rejected Stalinism but retained her faith in Leninism, describes watching what she called some literate, quote-unquote, believers from Voronezh, unquote, who refused to work on Easter and were made to stand barefoot on an ice-bound pool. Quote, I don't remember how long the torture, physical for the believers, moral for us observers, lasted. Barefoot on the ice, they went on praying, unquote. Weeping, the other prisoners asked, quote, was this fanaticism or fortitude in defense of the rights of conscience? Were we to admire them or regard them as mad? And most troubling of all, should we have had the courage to act as they did? Unquote. In spite of her Marxism, Ginsburg found herself sensing, quote, manifestations of that capital S supreme good, which in spite of everything rules the world, unquote. Part 6 is called The Vow. In addition to describing camps, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago also outlines the process by which Solzhenitsyn himself journeyed from Marxism to Russian Orthodox Christianity. Perhaps that is why it is subtitled, quote, an experiment in literary investigation. Gulag is literary as the Confessions of St. Augustine and some other Christian autobiographies are literary. Only this autobiography is collective as well as individual. The book works like this. Solzhenitsyn describes how he was arrested, then the many ways others were arrested. Next, he recalls his interrogation, followed by what he has learned about the interrogation of others, and so on. The journey to faith began when Solzhenitsyn remarked offhandedly to a fellow prisoner, the Jew Boris Gamarov, that of course President Roosevelt's public prayer was hypocritical. Gamarov asked furiously why Solzhenitsyn did not admit the possibility that Roosevelt actually believed in God. That question shocked Solzhenitsyn. Quote, to hear such words from someone born in 1923 that is educated after the revolution? I could have replied to him very firmly, but prison had already undermined my certainty. And the principal thing was that some clean, pure feeling does live within us, existing apart from all our convictions. And right there, it dawned on me that I had not spoken out of conviction, but because the idea had been planted in me from outside, unquote. Planted from outside. We have all seen people who profess a belief they have not really considered, say because they have not bothered to learn its weaknesses, or more often, because they want to belong to some social group holding them. It seems one can sincerely believe what one does not really believe, as Solzhenitsyn discovered of himself. This clean, pure feeling, this basic decency, which is Grossman's key theme in Life and Fate, gradually led Solzhenitsyn from Marxism to its opposite, Christian faith. When a person is imprisoned for years, he realized, quote, that is a good time to think. Think! Draw some conclusion from misfortune, unquote. It struck him that everyone in Soviet prisons and camps faced a choice. He could take or refuse to take a vow to survive at any price. That is, to survive at the expense of another. I quote, and whoever takes that vow allows his own misfortune to overshadow both the common misfortune and the whole world. That is the great fork in camp life. From this point, the roads go to the right and to the left. One of them will rise and the other will descend. If you go to the right, you lose your life. And if you go to the left, you lose your conscience, unquote. Most go to the left, but a few choose right. They value their soul more than their life, and so prison spiritually transforms them. Solzhenitsyn recalls, quote, in our country, they always mention Dostoevsky in this respect, unquote. One no longer yearns above all for the day of liberation, said Solzhenitsyn, quote, as if it were possible to liberate anyone who has not first become liberated in his own soul, unquote. And so part 7 is called Suffering and the Soul. Solzhenitsyn began to reflect on the key tenet of Soviet ethics, derived from the rejection of any meaning beyond the material world. That tenet was, only the result counts. Anything that doesn't produce the right result, any weak-kneed compassion for class enemies, for instance, anything obstructing the party's success, is by definition immoral. Only the result counts. When individuals apply this maxim to their lives as individuals, they value their survival and happiness above everything else. Anything promoting their own flourishing is justified. Only religious fools think otherwise. Suffering gradually taught Solzhenitsyn the opposite lesson. Quote, it is not the result, but the spirit. Not what, but how, unquote. As soon as you renounce surviving at any price, he explains, quote, Then prison begins to transform your character in an astonishing way, in a direction most unexpected to you. Instead of being intolerant of others, an understanding mildness becomes the basis of your uncategorical judgments. Marxist certainty is gone. You learn the biblical lesson, judge not lest ye be judged. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? A key step toward Christianity is recognizing one's own sinfulness and weakness, quote, and you can therefore understand the weakness of others, unquote. I continue to quote from Solzhenitsyn. And so your soul, which formerly was dry, now ripens from suffering, unquote. When we cease to think that only the result counts, we no longer regard others as instruments for our own happiness. Instead of seeing friendship as a compact useful to both people, quote, for the first time, we have learned genuine friendship, unquote. Rather than complain you are being punished for a crime you did not commit, you reconsider all your previous life, and you recall the bad deeds for which you were not punished. Quote, yes, you have been imprisoned for nothing. You have nothing to repent of before the state and its laws, but before your own conscience. But in relation to other individuals, unquote. Lying in a camp hospital after an operation, Solzhenitsyn met Dr. Boris Kornfeld, a Jew who had converted to Christianity, who tells him that if you ponder your life deeply enough, you will be able to find a transgression for which you have received this blow. Not the one for which you were punished, but something else. Kornfeld was murdered that very night, so Solzhenitsyn came to regard his last words, quote, as an inheritance. You cannot brush off that kind of inheritance by shrugging your shoulders. Kornfeld, he says, exaggerated. The evil really do prosper, and the good sometimes suffer out of proportion to their sins, but there is still a kernel of truth in his words. A Christian does not self-righteously condemn others and overlook his own transgressions. And Solzhenitsyn recalled the evil things he himself had done as a Soviet officer. In Tolstoy's novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, the hero at last realizes that he has always misunderstood life. When his worldly success was rising, his soul was actually descending. Solzhenitsyn came to the same realization. Quote, looking back, I saw that for my whole conscious life, I had not understood either myself or my strivings. What had seemed so long to be beneficial turned out, in actuality, to be fatal. And I had been striving to go in the opposite direction to that which was really necessary to me, unquote. What changed him was suffering. I think this emphasis on suffering is especially characteristic of Russian Orthodox thought and especially of Russian literature. Only through suffering does one attain what Solzhenitsyn calls higher meaning. On a personal note, whenever I hear the phrase, the American dream, the dream of attaining by hard work a materially prosperous life, I think, how shallow. Is that all life is about? Read Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Chekhov, as well as Pasternak, Grossman, and Solzhenitsyn, and one grasps what Solzhenitsyn meant in his Harvard address with his warning to the West. When people see personal happiness as their highest goal, he pointed out, they do not sacrifice themselves for others or their country or its ideals. They let someone else do it. No weapons, he said, can ensure a country's survival when enough people adopt such a view. It's the American counterpart to only the result counts. part 8 and last is called How Religion Differs from Revolution. In the key passage of the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn concludes, quote, "It was granted to me to carry away from prison on my bent back this essential experience, how a human being becomes evil and how good. In the intoxication of youthful success, I had felt myself to be infallible, and I was therefore cruel. In my most evil moments, I was convinced that I was doing good, and I was well supplied with systematic arguments. And it was only when I lay there on rotting prison straw that it was gradually disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart," unquote, including one's own. Today, more and more people seem inclined to profess the opposite lesson, that anyone who thinks differently must be evil. They draw the line between political parties or social groups and do not discern the evil in their own hearts. No society, and especially no democracy, can long survive under such conditions. In Solzhenitsyn's view, religion strives against the evil within each human being. Although it is impossible to abolish all evil from the world, one can constrict it within each person, he says, beginning with oneself. Revolutions, he continues, falsely presume the opposite. Quote, "They destroy only those carriers of evil," unquote, or the ones they think are carriers of evil, quote, "and then they take to themselves as their heritage the actual evil itself," unquote. Or as I like to put the point, nothing causes more evil than the attempt to abolish it altogether. Writers usually express sympathy for convicts as if imprisonment had to be nothing but an unmitigated evil. But it doesn't. "I nourished my soul there," Solzhenitsyn explains, "through its tradition of suffering as a source of the deepest insight. He came to Orthodox Christianity. His chapter about how that happened ends, quote, "I say without hesitation, bless you, prison, for having been in my life," unquote, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Morson, for this very provocative presentation that I think is raising a lot of questions for us, helping us see the ways that some of the most pressing ethical questions of our day were already anticipated 100 or more years ago by these Russian writers. We're going to have a chance for your questions here for Dr. Morson. At Anselm House, we try to practice some key virtues in our conversations that are helpful for learning. And if you've been around Anselm House, you've maybe heard me talk about these before in terms of 3 C's. So we've got some alliteration to help you kind of remember these virtues. The first one is curiosity. So please do form a question. Come eager to learn. Don't just have a comment or a statement that you want to make, but really be motivated by wanting to learn more. The second one is charity. So we want to go even beyond respect to trying to practice love for one another by understanding viewpoints that are different from ours and learning from one another. So we're going to try to practice charity. And the third one is concision, which is maybe more of a sort of a subset of the virtue. We practice virtue by being concise, but the idea here is we want to make room for more questions and for more perspectives in this conversation. So if you would try to practice those guidelines with us as we go into this Q&A, we would appreciate it. I'd like to start, perhaps, and see if we've got a question from a student in the audience. Oh, I see a hand go right up back there.
Thank you for your presentation, but I wanted to ask if you believe that in Dostoevsky's thesis, essentially, that religious morality trumps more humanistic interpretations, such as like Kant's, for instance, that would assert universal kind of, what do you call it, obligation to a universally applicable law. Do you think that a humanistic argument necessarily fails in favor of a theistic one?
I think what Dostoevsky and most of the Russians would say is that Kant's argument is really a Christian argument rephrased in philosophical terms, and there really isn't a contradiction there. What it clearly is not is a materialist argument, right? Because, you know, the right and wrong are objective. They're given in the nature of things. And that's the essence of what really counts in this argument. So, I mean, the few comments I know of Dostoevsky on Kant are all favorable. So, you know, I think you might want to say that where Dostoevsky and the Russians would differ is the fact that Kant thinks from the principle down and applies it to existence. And so it seems simpler than it is. That's why, for example, no matter what the consequences, lying is always the wrong thing to do. If you're thinking as a novelist would, from experience up, you're always going to be suspicious of such categoricals. Moral questions are always more complicated than any rules. So in that sense, they would differ.
Section to section. We've got one up here.
I wonder if you have any observations on the status of Solzhenitsyn's thought and literature in Putin's Russia.
In what?
In today's Russia. I mean, I think you see what I'm getting at.
No, I don't. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, if you have this wonderful assessment by Solzhenitsyn of the role of suffering, one might think that Solzhenitsyn's thought and literature would perhaps play a larger part in Putin's Russia than it apparently is playing.
Well, great literature is never all there is. I mean, I don't think it's fair to say if a country has Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, it shouldn't have a Putin. I mean, that is giving more credit to the power of literature than I think is warranted, right? I mean, you know, listen, these writers were writing under people a lot worse than Putin, like Stalin, right? And, well, it didn't seem to overthrow Stalin, I mean, right? So I would hope it would have more effect than it did, and maybe it has even more effect than I'm crediting it with, but you can't expect too much of it.
Well, my question was actually similar to that, but it was coming from the opposite direction. Russia has taken such a materialistic turn, and their religion there is suffering so much that I'm wondering, is good literature possible in Putin's Russia? And if it's not, where is the next place where the suffering is going to bring forth great literature?
Oh, if I knew the secret to what produces great literature, wow. I mean, who would have thought that the most intense period of creativity for the greatest literature in the history of the West would be 20 years in Tsarist Russia. There's never been 20 years like 1860 to 1880, which produced, the four, all of Dostoevsky, all of, War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, and Turgenev, and so on and so on. Even the period, let's say, in Renaissance England from Shakespeare to Milton was 80 or 90 years, right? And classical Greece, even longer. Who would have thought that? What's the secret there? I mean, I have no idea. And so I wouldn't want to say that it couldn't happen in Russia today. Somebody drawing on the great tradition of Russian literature who has absorbed it might just do something with it. And even in a country where literature is comparatively unimportant, like the United States, who knows, maybe even here we can produce a great writer. And I have, friends who will just love to say anything critical whatsoever about America and U.S. history, but just try to tell them that American literature is a third-rate literature, and you'll see their patriotism.
My question is, how has the virtue of cruelty, which the Bolsheviks advanced and held to very strictly, how has that affected, shall I say, the Russian soul, and how does it affect it today? What are the lingering impacts of that? I would love to hear your thoughts.
It's a good question. I think the legacy is really more cynicism, right? And I think even, a lot of the people who profess Russian Orthodoxy do it rather cynically. That is, what they really mean is, they ask them, well, what do you think of the Trinity? They don't know what you're talking about. They wear a big Russian Orthodox cross, but what it means to them is, I'm a Russian nationalist, which is not really being Christian, right? Of course, it's not the only time in history that Christianity is being abused that way, right? My guess is that the strongest legacy of that Soviet period has been a much greater increase in corruption, corruption was amazing in Tsarist Russia. There's a character in one of Turgenev's novels who says, he loves the spring when every bee takes a bribe from every little flower. Right? But in the increase in, under communism, listen, when nobody, you didn't care about the state's property. They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. Complete cynicism there. And then, that's what produced the kind of incredibly cynical capitalism that Russia then adopted and still has. I just love all those Harvard economists who think all you have to do is declare private property and you'll have prosperity. Not taking into account that culture matters, not just abstract laws of economics. And the legacy of the Soviet period, building on the legacy of the Tsarist period, left a lot to do, to be desired. You had incredible heroes with moral stature like we don't have, like, the great dissidents, like, Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, Sharansky, and in our times we saw it with Navalny, right? This is the best part of the Russian experience, that unbelievable heroism of willing to suffer and die for the most noble ideals, even if you think they're hopeless. But that's a very small number, and it's overwhelmed mostly by the cynical view.
There's a famous quote that says, philosophy poses the question and literature pens the answer. And I don't know if it's from you or from someone else, but I've heard it said that Dostoevsky, specifically in Brothers Karamazov, was trying to make an argument. He was obviously trying to show the flaws of materialism, but he chose not to write like an essay or an argument, but he chose to write in a story. So I was wondering if you could comment on kind of the power of story versus just writing, you know, a philosophical argument.
Yeah, well, it's not really the case that you first think through an idea as a philosopher, and then literature produces a nice, sweet, sugar-coated story to, you know, illustrate it. Most of the really great discoveries about human nature have been made first in fiction, and then the philosophers and psychologists try to systematize it in arguments. I mean, look, I can give you a really easy proof that Tolstoy, George Eliot, Jane Austen understood human nature and ethical problems better than any psychologist who ever lived. It's a very simple proof. If a psychologist understood people as well as Jane Austen, the psychologist could produce a picture of a human being as believable as she did. But none have come remotely close. Try to find one. I mean, the closest you'll find will be Freud's case studies, and they're still a long way from Jane Austen. So, did I answer your question, or did I stray too far?
I'm curious, was there any reference to or input from the mystical or Russian folk traditions in the conversions or in the process of moving to orthodoxy that you discovered?
You mean in contemporary Russia, or?
No, in the writers that you were.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I see. Yeah, I mean, Dostoevsky knew the Russian mystical tradition, and he certainly was quite influenced by the folk tradition. He quotes it all the time. I mean, you know, my favorite example, which was the topic of my talk in 1999, was there's a wonderful story in the Brothers Karamazov, right? It takes a whole couple of pages where the heroine, Grushik, is telling the story about how, you see, there was this wicked old woman who died. She had never done a good deed in her life. And she was thrown into the burning lake with all the other sufferers. And her guardian angel pitied her. And her guardian angel remembered that, in fact, she had done one good deed. She had once given an onion to a beggar. An onion is the cheapest thing you could imagine. And so she runs to God to tell him, and God says, okay, he says, you take that onion and you pull her out of hell with it. And so the angel flies over and held out the onion, and the woman, grabs onto it and is slowly pulling her up because they don't want the stem of the onion to break. And seeing her being lifted out of the lake, the other sinners grab onto her legs so they'll be lifted out too. And at that moment, she kicks them away, saying, "No, it's my onion, not yours." And at that moment, the stem breaks, and she's been rotting in hell ever since. Okay? Now, there's so many things, that you can get out of this story. I mean, it fits with the whole idea of the book that small deeds are what matter, not dramatic ones, right? Giving an onion. But also that you have the ability to take whatever incident of your life you like and make it the principle and then live according to it, even if it's relatively rare. She refuses to do that, but she has the chance of making that one good deed who she really is. We always have that choice. This is a folk tale, right? That Dostoevsky retell. Of course, he fills it, the situation will bring out its meaning, but it clearly, that sort of thing, deeply influenced his thinking, right?
Well,
we've got time for maybe one more question here. Oh, Ben.
Yes, I hope it's not too long an answer then, but you briefly mentioned Master and Margarita as I think maybe in section 5, and I wondered if you had summary comments on your opinions of that. Easter's coming, Pontius Pilate's coming.
Oh, there you are. I wasn't seeing where to talk. What do you want me to comment on? The Master?
It fit into section 5, you were saying, but then you briefed over it, and I was kind of hoping you would incorporate it into the storyline and wondered if you had any overarching thoughts on the book. I've
the Master
just enjoyed that one very much.
Yeah, The Master and Margarita is an absolutely, absolutely wonderful book. And, one way to, this is not the most important thing about it, but it fits with what we're saying now, that if there is a text that underlies at least the second part of the book, it's about love, okay? And not just the love of the Master and Margarita, but there's another love that's easy to miss, and that is the love of Pilate and his dog, okay? Where it says, Pilate was condemned, to relive this incident for 2,000 years, and his dog was sentenced with him, but that's what happens when you love someone, you share their fate, okay? It's a book about love, and the text underneath it is the Song of Songs, right? Love is stronger than death, which is what you get there. So maybe that's, one of the ways you can see, the religious aspect of the book.
I think that is a fitting note to end on, although I know we've got more questions. I've got more questions. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Morson for this lecture tonight?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gary. Because I know there are more questions, we are going to continue our Anselm House tradition of having a reception afterwards. You are invited to stay around to continue the conversation with one another and with Dr. Morson. As we turn to that, I have just a few upcoming Anselm House events that I want to draw your attention to. The first one is that if you're new to Anselm House, we'd invite you to attend one of our open houses. There's one coming up on April 16th. This is just a quick introduction to the Anselm House mission. You'll get to hear from Anselm House staff, some students. It's really the best way to find out more about what we do. It's hosted right across the street over at Melrose Station there, over the noon hour, and lunch is included. So would invite you to sign up for that if you want to find out more about Anselm House. Second, if you're a current or prospective UMN student, would invite you to check out our Fellows Program Preview Night, which is coming up on April 14th. Our Fellows Program is a multi-year program of Christian education and formation that's hosted over dinner discussions all throughout the year. And this preview night is a chance to come check it out, to visit, see if it's something that you might be interested in joining for next year. So I would invite you to take a look at that. And then finally, our Center for Faith and Learning is hosting several events in the fields of healthcare and business that are coming up. There's actually too many of them for me to go into right now. But if you are in the field of healthcare or business, I would invite you to talk to someone at our table, Phil or AJ back there, afterward, and find out more about those events. For all of these events, you can go onto the Anselm House website, find out more, and RSVP there. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. AJ is reminding me about the evaluations. If you would either put them in the baskets that we have at the back, or you can leave them on your seat, and we'll go around and collect any filled out evaluations. We would very much appreciate it. Thanks again. Enjoy refreshments and enjoy further conversation. Thanks so much, Gary. This was great.
I hope it's what you
Absolutely, absolutely.